everybody. Good morning. It's so great to be here. JC, thank you for inviting me, and thank you to all of your team for all the assistance they gave me in getting ready for today. So I'm from Brooklyn. You can probably shock based on my accent that I'm not from right around here. And I grew up in Brooklyn. For those of you who know it, it's become like the coolest place in the New York metro area these days. When I was there, it was seen as completely uncool. In fact, when I went off to college in Connecticut, I was frequently teased for my accent. And I'd say I'm from Brooklyn, and people would go like, no kidding. But I always thought it was pretty cool, even back then, because it was just this big, crazy borough cohabitated by people from all over the world, coming together to form neighborhoods, schools, and communities. And we're all shaped in our adult life a little bit by our early life experience and by how we grow up. And as I look back to that experience in Brooklyn, of course, I didn't appreciate it then, a lot of my views about leading innovation and really the people issues, which is a lot, the people challenges and opportunities, which as I'm going to talk about today, were probably shaped back then in my early childhood. And one of the key formative experiences in my life back then was working behind the counter in my dad's pharmacy. My dad was Harold, and he owned we had our family business, Harold's Prescriptions. It was still there, although the neon sign is gone, at 2272 McDonald Avenue, right under an elevated line of the subway. And because none of his 5 children were members of the union, he could and did frequently draft us to come into the store and do whatever needed to be done. And whether it was unpacking inventory or stocking shelves or dusting merchandise, he was really kind of compulsive. So he'd go around with a ruler, making us straighten the bottles on the shelves. But really the most fun part was when he planted us behind the counter, which was about 20 feet away from the main entrance to the store. And it was kind of interesting because you never knew who was going to come through the door. And you had about 10 seconds to get ready to address that particular customer's need. So forget about my MBA. I think my training ground for really understanding customers and their needs and knowing how to serve them was in those moments behind the counter in my dad's store. And because he served everybody, from blue-collar immigrants pretty much off the boat from Italy to there was nearby a big Sephardic community of very wealthy immigrants from the Middle East who lived in those days, I thought they were mansions. They were packed a little too tightly together along this beautiful boulevard, Ocean Parkway, for those of you who might know Brooklyn. For me, collaborating, communicating, understanding what people needed was not an academic concept or some human resource concept. It was really what life was about. So I was very, very grateful for those experiences. And then, fast forward to now and the publication of my book, The Changemakers Playbook, How to Seek, Seed, and Scale Innovation in Any Company. I spent more years than I like to remember at this point working in large jobs in corporate America. I was a C-suite executive, mostly in consumer financial services, ending up as Citigroup's first chief innovation officer. But I decided to leave the corporate world. And when I finally did leave, I didn't really know what quite to do with myself. But I had this friend named Kevin, and he had planted a bee in my bonnet about 10 years ago to write a book on innovation. He said, you know a lot about this, and you seem to be really passionate about it, so you should write a book. And then when I finally did leave the corporate world, and honestly, I didn't know what to do with myself, I started to talk to people I knew who had written books. And, what's it like to write a book? Is it hard? Can I do it? How do you go about it? And a colleague of mine who had written several books, he said to me, Amy, don't write a book if you think you're going to make any money at it, because you definitely won't. The only good reason to write a book is if you think you have something to say. And when he said that, I sort of knew I was in, and that I was going to write the book. And what I wanted to say, and what I ended up saying, is that there is, whether we are founders at startups or entrepreneurs at big companies or academics or regulators, the innovations are often hiding in plain sight. And when you ask people why innovation fails, oftentimes, we didn't have ideas, we didn't have the capital, we didn't have the technology. But so often what I find is those things are all abundant, especially capital. I mean, there's almost too much capital these days sloshing around. But so often the failure comes from our inability to seek out insight and learn from others who have been down remarkably similar paths to ours before, even though they may not look so similar. And that's why oftentimes the ideas are hiding in plain sight. And I was very lucky to have very many mentors and advisors throughout my career who sort of kept me in line. And one of my first innovation mentors, he used to say, Amy, the best place to look for ideas is far away from what you know already. Get outside your sector. Get outside the kind of people you deal with. Get beyond. And it really took me back to what I had learned implicitly from my dad. And then I worked for a CEO, one of the last CEOs who I reported to in the corporate world. He used to say, steal shamelessly. And of course, he meant ethically, right? And he meant, ethically and morally, but he was really giving the same message. Go wherever you can to get ideas. And so I think in coming here today, when I spoke to the Sengen folks, but like, well, why do you want me to come here? I don't know anything about telecom, except I'm oftentimes a very unhappy customer of my telecom provider, with whom I'm frequently on the phone with my many customer service issues and arguing about my bill. But it was specifically, I really appreciate the opportunity to come to an audience because my purpose now is so much as I pursue my career to share my expertise with others, and by being able to bring what I know from very different life and career experiences to you, hopefully I will leave you with some good value. But the starting point to learn those lessons that are hiding in plain sight is curiosity. And so how often do we ask the next question? Like, let's try something else, or how did you come up with that, or why not do this or that, as opposed to the tendency of, oh, that won't work, or we tried that before, So it's the curiosity comes from being able to ask the next question. And I came across, in getting ready for this presentation, I surfaced some research studies, and there was a study reported in the Harvard Business Review that shockingly stated only 24% of employees feel curious at work. Right? Now that's pretty incredible. And if curiosity is known to correlate to innovation and business results and creativity, imagine that you could potentially be one of those people working in a business or academic where only 24% of people are curious. And another study that was published recently involving people whose curiosity was measured at the beginning of a job and 6 months later showed that only 6 months into a new role, their curiosity had diminished by 20%. So what do you think happens? I mean, clearly there's this, we feel so much pressure to maintain the status quo, right? There's the risk of looking dumb if you ask a bad question. Or one of the experiences that I personally underwent many times is that there's a perception that sometimes if you ask too many questions, you're slowing things down. But actually the ability to ask smart, probing questions that really get to the bottom of what the other person is dealing with can actually end up being an innovation accelerant. So curiosity just becomes a critical ingredient. So when I left the corporate world, I decided to try working with startups. I mean, I knew I really needed a big change from kind of the grind, as much as being in a big company has many wonderful attributes. I was really ready for something else. And so I said, well, I'm going to start bringing what I know to startup companies. And what immediately struck me was how much founders at startups and people trying to drive transformation and change in large established organizations, how much they had in common. And it's really interesting because sure, they're different, right? But more interesting to me was how complementary they could be. But you know what happens. Startups like to say, oh, those big established organizations, they're just a bunch of dumb old dinosaurs and we're about to wipe them out. We're getting rid of them. And so how could I possibly learn anything from them? And then of course you talk to large established organizations, and particularly in the halo of the kinds of things we've been reading about lately with SoftBank and WeWork and Uber, they'll say, startups? They're not held to any standard of accountability to ever make a profit. Those guys are getting away with murder. What can I possibly learn from them? But more important to me and more significant, I think, to you, no matter what hat you're wearing, because I know this is a This is a group of people brought together from pretty diverse backgrounds. You're in a real position to learn from each other and sort of respect the fact that the differences and that ability to exercise curiosity and ask that next set of questions can really lead you to progress on the third goal in the plan that JC just talked about. So let's talk about, and what I want to do today is share some insights, share some ideas from what I've seen on what the two sides, if you will, can learn from each other, and then end with a few points, a couple of stories from my own experiences that really show how far you can get in terms of advancing innovation by exercising some of that curiosity muscle. So let's talk about big companies. It's really easy to beat up on big established organizations, and I have got plenty of evidence, because I was one of these people who spent 25 years on the inside of very monolithic organizations trying to get change to happen. Tried to seed innovation even before that was a popular business buzzword. We know how bureaucratic they are, ponderously slow, seem to thrive on creating complexity and get super bogged down in the way things have always been done, right? And in what they believe. But if you think about it, every big organization was at one point a startup, right? They know how to operate at scale, which is something that startups really struggle with. How do you scale? There is something to be said for predictability. And they have within their organizations amazing talent. And because sector talent tends to be somewhat incestuous, the people who are tenured in these businesses know their domains well, they know the competition, and they have relationships wide and deep across their domain. So there's a lot of value in those organizations that can benefit people who haven't been in them. Think about startups. They just are not burdened by any notion of a legacy. They seem to thrive on resource scarcity and this passionate commitment to the ideal that they're trying to achieve. The problem is that a lot of them may be furiously and passionately barking up the wrong tree. So, my view is, and I want to advocate to you, is that startups and big companies have a lot to gain from each other. And I'm going to share some examples that come from the experiences that I've had over my career, and especially in the last 5 years, and as I did the research for my book. I'll talk first about a few recommendations for established organizations. And the first one is really the need to expand your tool set so that it's fit for the purpose of innovation. So there's a saying that I love, when all you have is a hammer, everything looks like a nail. And for those of you who've been in large organizations, you probably have had the experience of, these guys are really, really good at hammering away at whatever comes their way. And that might be great if all you're trying to do is what you've always done, right? If you're a large organization and you're concerned with just banging it out, you just want to keep banging away. But that hammer can pretty much smother the potential of a new idea or maybe of a startup relationship that you're trying to establish. So take vendor management or procurement, which are two of my favorite corporate functions to pick upon. If they are set up for cost control and getting the lowest bid price and making sure the company that you're bringing in is financially stable, they're going to smother the potential of being able to work with a startup and really cause them to not want to work with you if you don't kill them first. So, or metrics. The traditional metrics of an established organization tend to be geared towards short-term results. Now, if you're testing some bold new idea, why do you think you want to measure yourself against turning a profit in the next quarter or two? You're basically setting yourself up for failure. So the tool set really has to be expanded if you want to really drive innovation in a large established environment. Find the tools that are fit for purpose. The next recommendation I'll share is it seems so obvious, but in a study that was done last year of several hundred corporate CEOs, on how they spent their time, they reported as a group that they only spent 3% of their time with customers. Now, I find that to be pretty tragic, especially when I'm willing to bet that most of those same CEOs are out telling their people that they need to put the customer at the center of everything they do. Like, really? You know, startups don't have huge budgets for market research. They don't have money to buy expensive syndicated studies. And they certainly don't have big customer service units who are gathering and filtering data and putting them into neat little PowerPoints to send to the C-suite. That's why great founders learn about their customers by spending time with them in their environments, seeing really how they operate and understanding their problems. And if you're not doing that already, I suggest that you do. It's just really, really, really mind-opening. The third recommendation for big established organizations is if you want to succeed as an innovator in any of these domains, you've got to be willing, able, and ready to take on the bureaucracy and do some end runs around it. It's been interesting for me personally, so much good learning from watching how founders operate, because most of them, you know, they don't have time for bureaucracy. The clock is running on their cash. They have a certain amount of time to prove a result, and they are, you know, as I said, pretty passionate and determined, at least the better ones. A lot of them, if they haven't come from a big company world, they don't even know what bureaucracy is. So it's that fearless focus on not, and it gets back to the tool set. If you are going to try to accomplish innovation in a large organization by embracing the way the organization operates today versus figuring out safe and constructive ways around it, it will be very, very hard to succeed. So let's talk about startups and a couple of thoughts that I have for them. You know, it's always a little bit of a red flag for me when I meet with a founder who's telling me about their business. And this goes for B2B, B2C, B2B2C, it doesn't matter where they are, when they say, oh, we're not ready for marketing. And my suggestion is to think about the fact that, and maybe this is because I've been a CMO and I grew up in a marketing function, so I kind of tend to defend marketing, that marketing is not about, you know, going for likes on social media or putting up webinars or having big advertising budgets. So before you think that you're not ready for marketing, go and find out what a real CMO does. Because a marketing function should be the function that helps you understand your customers, formulate value propositions that they really want, and design and test go-to-market strategies that can actually help you achieve revenue cost effectively. That's what good CMOs are up to. And they are doing that by collaborating with technology and operations and finance and other functions in the business to figure out how their understanding and insights into your customers and users is going to impact and relate to the business model and the operations of the organization. Startups really sell themselves short, and really any business sells themselves short when they think of marketing as just, you know, social media volume and, you know, and banner ads. It can be a lot more than that if you have the right person and core to understanding customers and building a business. The second point that I want to talk about relative to startups is that, you know, a lot of startups, and maybe because I've had so much exposure to early stage companies, seem to sort of revel in the messiness of being a startup. But the reality is part of scaling up is embracing process and some discipline. Years ago, I worked under a CEO who was a process hound. And I remember at first people in the organization were very resentful because when we want to do things our way, you know, they saw process as really constraining. And his view was that good process that is designed to facilitate giving customers and users what they need so that you can run your business is actually very liberating and helps people be successful and focus on the things that they want to do. Process is only bureaucratic when it's driven by internal needs to control, or when it's one of those hammers banging away at things that aren't actually nails. So I'd say process is really the key, is really one of the keys to scaling, if that's the point that you're at. And finally, my third piece of advice for startups is, and again, this sounds so obvious, but build things that really solve market problems. I'm an angel investor, and I've been involved in several angel investing groups over the last few years, so I've heard hundreds of pitches. And there are a lot of technology companies out there pushing product, solving trivial or me too or inconsequential problems. And as I was talking to some folks this morning and last night, there's a lot of big problems out there to be solved. And this industry, even more so than financial services, where I come from, is just every place and is so core, as JC said, to economic prosperity and something that touches the lives of every single person every day. So the ability to meet real market needs and solve real problems within viable business models is there. It's just a matter of your leadership and focus. So I want to share with you a couple of examples to bring to life this point that I think is so critical to leading innovation, which is having the curiosity to ask the questions and really focus on your customers and your users. And the examples are going to come from industries that I'm familiar with, but hopefully will leave you with some of those aha moments of, wow, it really does pay to look outside. And plus, these are things that I'm familiar with and come from my personal experience, so I can speak about them really easily. The first one has to do with collecting on bad loans. And by the way, all these examples are going to be more B2C, but the lessons apply no matter who your customers and users are. And we can talk about that offline if you'd like to. So I'm sure that nobody in this room has ever defaulted on a loan. But let's just imagine for a moment that that's a pretty embarrassing, shaming, regrettable experience that none of us want to have. And in the consumer lending business, at least in the United States, the traditional way of working with people who are not paying you back in a timely manner is to call them on the phone. And you can imagine no one wants that phone call, right? It's embarrassing, especially if it comes at dinner time and your family's sitting there and the phone rings. And I worked with a team in banking who said, well, let's think about the customer, the borrower. This is a really embarrassing experience. Most people really want to pay you back. What if we gave them a digital option and didn't call them on the phone because the phone call is really embarrassing, and we helped them feel in control of their repayment? So this team thought, that is a really brilliant idea because it's very customer focused and it's really thinking about the emotion and the situation that they're in. So the team went down the hall to the folks in credit operations and said, well, we need a test file. We need some people to try this out on. We want to prototype a user experience and see what happens. And the people who were so used to this traditional phone-based model thought this was such a dumb idea that it took about 2 years and I know it was my team. I kept sending them back. I was like, we are not giving up. This is a big idea. It took them about 2 years to get a test file. And the test file that they got finally was one for which credit people had no telephone numbers anyway. So they figured, no downside. They're not. And I will tell you what happened. The test was so amazingly successful, not because of rational spreadsheet analysis or anything whizzy about the technology, but because we really thought about what is it like to be a person in this situation, that now there's not a major financial institution in the world that doesn't have a digital collections experience as part of their core customer experience design. And so, but it was very counterintuitive, very driven by emotion, totally driven by qualitative insight into what is it like and what's people's real motivation and how can we engage with them differently and take the shame out of it. So interesting example, might provoke some thinking. The second one I want to talk about is life insurance. And I know there's nothing you would rather talk about than life insurance, right? It's like the topic everybody flees from. But similarly, in the United States, and I'm not familiar with the statistics for Canada, I'm sorry, but in the United States, ownership of life insurance has been on a decline since the 1960s. And that situation, and there's a lot of reasons why that we won't go into, but at the same time, the agent workforce has been diminishing. Aging, the average insurance agent in the United States is like a 59-year-old white guy. So you could just imagine the receptivity of that person who wants to come and meet you, in your kitchen in the evening. So you can imagine the receptivity of that whole experience to today's life insurance prospect is, there's a growing mismatch. And so the team I was working with said, well, let's go out and talk to, a few dozen life insurance owners about why they bought insurance and how they came to figure out what to do. And the agents in the company we were working with were pretty, they were kind of rolling their eyes and say, well, we know what happens. We're basically, they saw themselves as the sun, the moon, and the stars. And the life insurance buyer didn't know what to do, had to come to them and be told what to do, and they were basically the source of all knowledge. And we said, well, that's okay. We have a budget. We're going to go out and go ask some people. So we sat down with people and had them come with their personal balance sheets. So we talked to them about what they did. And we learned some pretty interesting things. Like, for example, for the people in this company's target market, before they got to an agent, they had already consulted 10 sources, many of whom were not licensed professionals. So people asked relatives. People asked Uncle Joe, who was very successful. So they figured Uncle Joe must know what to do. Or they asked their girlfriends at dinner because their girlfriends were just like them. So, or, obviously they went online. They searched. And so this was a real balloon burster for the agents who had to start to come to the terms with the fact that they were not in control of the process. But it also gave the business incredible insight to do very basic things like understanding, wow, we need to really enrich and commit to our search capability. Because the first thing people are doing is going to Google. And we are not supporting that. Down to when you ask people how they figured out how much insurance to buy, people's mental and mathematical ability, most people, is pretty bad. And so people had no idea. So that led to all kinds of concepting around how could we improve the experience of the conversation and help people figure out how much they need. And so product ideas. And so just by asking people, well, how did you do that? Like, take me through the story of how you actually got to the product. And what did you do then? And what did you do then? Asking lots of questions is very, very revealing and leads you to a lot of ideas about, product, technology investment, and also, really importantly, how to sell. The last example I want to share is one about commuting. Now, you don't have a big rapid transit system here, from what I could tell. But having grown up in New York and being a commuter, even in high school, I had to take 2 subways and a bus to get to my high school because I went to a magnet school. I understand the pain of the commute when you're in a large, aging, rapid transit system. And a bank I was working with had been approached by the Metropolitan Transit Authority in New York about bringing payments infrastructure into the subway system. And their game was, in New York, we have these Metro cards, which have a high failure rate, and the MTA has been hostage to one vendor for decades. They're expensive, and you can imagine the bureaucracy of working with the MTA. But some visionary person at the MTA about 10 or 15 years ago had this idea that we could bring RFID into the subway, and that would address a lot of the operational and cost issues that the MTA was having, because clearly queuing and crowding in the station, not only is it a hassle, it's a big security issue. So, so the team started to actually did one of the first tests in the United States and probably globally of contactless payments in the subway system. So this team had to go back to management in the bank and say, well, we want to test contactless technology in the subway. And by the way, we're going to have to make an extra tag that has the chip in it, because at that point we were using flip phones. So there was no iPhone that had an RFID chip in it. And people just about, threw up on the idea, well, how much is that going to cost? And how much is that going to add? And what's the business case for that? And the team's view was, commuting is a hassle. And most people in major metro areas are suffering under their commutes. And can we bring value into our product by being a brand that makes the commute better? And will that encourage people to want to use the bank's products and services more? So it's a very different way of thinking about the business model. And certainly, the team was not solving a banking problem. They were solving a problem in the customer's life that ultimately could tie back to a banking relationship because you got to pay for that commute. And what the team found, they sort of soldiered on and did not put up with the naysaying internally, got support from the CEO, not only in the near term, a meaningful increase in brand loyalty. So the hypothesis sort of worked. By easing the commute, people will like the bank better, very counterintuitive, but ultimately, and very importantly, gave that organization incredible learning and a head start on understanding how to bring contactless payments into transit systems, which have now they're becoming ubiquitous around the world, and also gave that bank a use case that ended up helping them land deals in other markets as contactless payments started to expand in importance. And the thing about New York, that if you can make it there, you can make it anywhere, that it was an incredible use case for this organization to have because transit operators in other parts of the world took notice. And the fact that the team was able to get this done in New York gave them confidence in wanting to bring them in to other markets. So it's another story about, and what all of these are about, if you're listening, if you're taking the time to understand your users and your customers, asking that next question, getting outside the constraints of your current business model, and really being driven by what your users' problems are, that is where the seeds for much great innovation lies. And it's not a marketing problem. It's an opportunity for product, for engineering, for customer service, for operations, for any function in the organization to just understand that better. So I'm going to give you a very simple framework to help you do that. And again, I'm going to talk through a personal example. It's easier for me, which is my family's experience with Netflix, which you might be able to relate to closer in your business and maybe personally. So if you take out a piece of paper, it'd be a really, really simple matrix that you can write down, and you might even remember it. If you just write in one column, users, buyers, payers, and influencers. I actually should have noticed influencers here because they're very important. And then on the other axis, features, benefits, and values. Ideally, when you're going off on your explorations to understand what's going on in your market, and again, this is whether B2B or B2C, there are most likely users, buyers, payers, and influencers to every product decision. And we know that people, although technology people, and you guys are probably really good at this, tend to push the great engineering and feature functionality, even if you're in a business setting, you're buying for higher order reasons. You're buying for benefits and you're buying for values. So let me take you through the example of my family with Netflix, and you'll see what that means. So we have a 14-year-old daughter at home, and since I am traveling around a lot and my husband works too, we've got a caregiver, and then we've got obviously my husband and I. And let's think about my daughter has all of her friends. A 14-year-old girl is heavily influenced by all 1,400 of her Instagram followers. Don't ask how that happened. There are only 400 kids in her entire grade at school. So I'm still trying to figure out where 1,400 came from, but she's influenced, all teenage girls are. And so she comes home from school and she wants to watch something on Netflix. She's clearly, we have the Netflix account for her. I almost never use it. Why does she want it? Because she wants to see the latest content so she can go to school and tell her influencer friends that she's cool and fits in. So yes, she's bored, she wants entertainment, she has free time, but in the end, her values are around acceptance in her social network, right? The caregiver is the buyer. She's sort of the gatekeeper. And she's deciding, is my daughter going to be allowed to watch the program or not? Now, what is she looking for? She wants to maintain control over the situation. She wants to make sure my daughter does her homework. She wants to make sure she's not watching inappropriate content. She wants to feel like she's doing a good job. She's very maternal. So she's got values around really doing the right thing because she loves my daughter. So those are her values, right? We are the payers, right? My husband and I, we're the ones who have every month the credit card charge for Netflix hits our bill. We're paying for it. What do we want? I want family harmony. I don't want my daughter calling me on the phone while I'm sitting in Ottawa saying, "Mommy, I'm bored." Or, Luce won't let me watch the movie. Or, all of my friends have seen it. Why can't I see it? And so I'm concerned about clearly things like control, but I want harmony. I don't know if my child is well taken care of. So and then there are my daughter's influencer friends. So if you start to parse what each of these different constituents, and because they're all your stakeholders, no matter what part of this ecosystem you sit in, you all have these stakeholders. Start to parse what benefits are they seeking, but even more important, what do they value? That's how you get into the conversations where you can really understand what should you be building and creating, where should your priorities lie. And I would think with in this industry, who basically have the ability to affect connectivity, the opportunities up there for values are huge. So I would try that. It's something that's written up in my book in the chapter on discovery, and I found people derive a lot of benefit from it. So just wanted to share that with you. So in closing, as I said, I've been out in the corporate and startup world for a while, and I've seen a lot. And I tell my kids that I'm not really a boomer. I'm really a millennial inside the body of a boomer. And one thing that I continue to see is a need, and in some ways a deepening need, for increasing collaboration and for people to engage with others whose backgrounds and experiences, whether life experience, work experience, education experience, there's just such an increasing need in a world that unfortunately, at least in the country that I live in, just feels increasingly polarized and less tolerant. I think a lot of the driving force for innovation is going to come to those people who get outside that and really find different ways to collaborate and expand their curiosity to get ideas even from the non-obvious sources. And I think, especially since the financial crisis, a real loss of courage in a lot of C-suites and people just in their personal lives being driven by fear. And I think fear is one of the greatest derailers of innovation. The literature major in me loves to understand the origin of words. And so I looked up the origin of the word courage. And courage comes from, and its Latin root is cor, which of course means heart, but also is parallel to the old French word courage, which also means heart. And I think succeeding in innovation, it's head and heart, right? Because it's having the technical smarts, the money, the ideas, but it's also having the moral and ethical courage and perseverance to keep going because it's hard and it's new. So those are my comments. I think we have a little time for questions if we use a microphone. I'd be happy to take questions from you. But thank you.
Questions for Amy? Well, thank you. Over here?
That's either speak really loud or use a mic. I won't hear you.
Hello. Hello.
Hi.
Hello, Amy. Thank you very much for that talk. One question that I want to debate or question you on, you said that companies should really attempt to solve a real problem. And I don't know if it's revisionist history, but Steve Jobs at one point said, everybody needs a phone. Now, I know in 2019 we all do, but at the time, I would have said, well, you know, who wants to be constantly interrupted? Who needs this? But he had in his head, this is a real problem that needs to be solved. But I'm wondering if I could go back in time, I would love to see, did everybody else feel that it was a real problem that needed to be solved? And hence my question is, what's the defining characteristic between being a Steve Jobs and seeing the future, having that vision and telling people what they need versus having a real, true problem that needs to be solved?
So I think it's really interesting, and thanks. And I wish I could get inside Steve Jobs' head. I actually was honored last week to meet John Reed, who I don't know if you know John Reed was the person who invented it. I mean, he led the invention and deployment of ATMs. He basically told people, you know, you don't need a bank to bank. So similar kind of visionary. I think the same with Steve Jobs. You know, he's very famously quoted all the time as saying that he didn't believe in market research and that people couldn't tell you what they needed. And I think I agree with both of those statements, because most people cannot tell you what they need. I think what I would bet, without being presumptuous, because how could I presume what Steve Jobs was thinking, that what he observed was the unarticulated need and value that people placed on connectivity. And, you know, right, I could never have told you that I needed an iPhone. And a couple of weeks ago, I actually went on a trip and my phone broke right before the trip. I was like almost in a panic. And then I said, well, this is great. My kids can't call and hassle me about the latest thing I haven't done for them lately. And I survived without the phone for 36 hours. But I think it's what he saw, I think what he may have sensed was the unarticulated value. So there's needs and there's values, right? The unarticulated value that people place on connectivity. The same way as John Reed, when he deployed ATMs, and people, you know, at the boardroom at Citi must have thought he was crazy. Like, okay, I'm going to put a machine in the lobby of the bank where people can go pull out their money 24/7. I mean, in the days when banks were open 9 to 3, like, the board must have thought he was out of his mind. But what he saw was the value that people would place on that ease and convenience of not being locked into doing things Monday to Friday, 9 to 3, because your family's financial needs are 24/7. So I think it's that, and the thing that Steve Jobs, he did not believe, at least if you believe what you read about him, in formal market research studies. And I don't even like to use the phrase market research anymore, because to me it has the connotation of going and fielding some big study or calling people into a focus group. The examples that I gave here, the insights all came from sitting down and having conversations with, you know, a large handful of users who met the profile of people we wanted to understand. And Steve Jobs is very famous for behavior observation, right? So people cannot tell you, but you can often see in their behavior. So I'll give you an example. Right after the financial crisis, like in 2010, I was working for E-Trade, the online brokerage company, as their chief innovation officer, and we were trying to get people in the US had put trillions of dollars into certificates of deposit, which of course pay like nothing. So they were parking their money in a safe place, but really hurting themselves because of the opportunity cost of not being in the middle. And so we went into people's homes. We said, well, who do we want to talk to in terms of the assets that they have in the profile? And we went and did some interviews with people in their homes. And some of my colleagues actually did not want to go. It made them uncomfortable to go. It's like they thought it was like somehow creepy. But you know, people like telling you what they think. And if you ask people for their opinion and show a genuine interest, you're almost like, that's on Maslow's hierarchy, as far as I'm concerned. So a couple of us went with a professional interview into people's homes, and it's not just what people tell you, it's what you observe. So we asked people to show us, well, show us the area in your house where you pay your bills, and show us what you do with your financial documents. And you could learn so much just from observing what people are doing or not doing. You know, they're the people who have like binders with everything really organized, so they remember to download and save every statement. And then there was one family where they had a supermarket bag of unopened statements in the corner of their dining room. I mean, so what does that tell you about their needs? And what else do you want to know about them? And how does that lead to solutions? And so I think behavior, I think observing is a really important part of getting insight. And I'm a big believer in go speak to some people who you think are in your target audience and listen and watch. And you will get a lot of insight. And to me, that's very much how Steve Jobs seems to have operated and get to their, what do they really value? Not how many more buttons can I put on the phone? Like why I need extra cameras on my iPhone 11 is completely beyond me. But I really like the fact that I can reach my kids wherever I am in the world. That's what I value.
Thanks for that great question. We have time
Great
for
question.
one more, I think. Yes, right here.
Hi, Amy. So as a female leader and top leader in several big corps around in the world, so what's your view on the gender equality in this, here we are in ICT industry, the tech industry, and also what's your view on this gender equality issue and the diversity issue plays a role in this innovation, the whole ecosystem entrepreneurship? Thank you.
That's a hard question. Coincidentally, yesterday, I spent an hour on the phone with a Wall Street Journal reporter who's exploring the question, why aren't there more women in the C-suite? And I wish there was an easy answer. I mean, everybody has a personal story. I think for me, my parents had 5 kids and 3 of us were girls. And my mom never finished college because her parents didn't encourage her to. Her brothers became engineers and my mom got married. And my parents really pushed us. You know, they taught us to see that we had no limits. Unfortunately, I think not just the corporate world, but the startup world has a lot of work to do on diversity. And you know, when I make, and so I've seen in the corporate world, I think it all comes down to leadership. And if there's not a senior executive influencing or driving hiring decisions who really believes that having people from different backgrounds, and not just gender, but you know, women I think still need a little extra boost. If the senior executive doesn't believe that and isn't committed to it, it just won't happen. And it's just not just a matter of hiring. The point I made to this reporter, it's also setting people up for success, right? Because you could be hired into the situation and still face a lot of these micro inequity issues that come from childhood, you know. And so I think it's on the shoulder of the CEO to make sure that that changes and to include in the succession plan women who can move legitimately into the CEO role. On startups, I will tell you, when I'm screening an early stage company that's seeking investment, the very first thing I do is go to the About Us page and look at the photos. I want to see who's on the team. Because when you're an early stage startup, chances are everything you're assuming is wrong. Your business model's probably wrong, your product's probably wrong, everything you're assuming is wrong. And what's going to make the difference is the team. It's going to be the founder and who they surround themselves with. And so I really look at that, and I find it's startups tend to, you know, and I hate generalizing, but I see too many About Us pages where the teams are homogeneous. And, you know, they're a bunch of guys who all went to Stanford together and studied computer science. So I don't want to offend anybody, but literally, or it's a lot of women. And I think either one is bad. So I would really seek and support diverse team compositions. It's really a success driver.
Okay, I think that's all we have time for. Thank you so much, Amy, for your
Thank you for having me. Have a great day.
presentation.